ultimately, if we could use Pro Dollar to measure profitability on the group of 58 animals, that's what we probably should do. But this is a pretty good indicator that when we selected for Pro Dollar, we ended up with higher performing animals. And it's interesting, when I do this farm after farm, it's almost always at least 40 kilograms of fat difference from top quartile to bottom. And the other thing that's amazing to me is how producers are amazed by this. And it shocks me actually, because everybody is trying to use as good genetics as they possibly can. And then we're kind of surprised that our top performers are from our best genetics. We shouldn't be surprised. If you breed for a trait, that's what you're going to get time after time. So does everybody understand how I did this? So we can do this with dairy comp quite easily. It's just a simple line command in your dairy comp to separate your top genetic animals from your bottom ones in a particular group. And I always use 2-year-olds because they're less selected, and almost always you find a 40 kilogram fat difference from top to bottom. Okay.
I would add to that as well that I would say the average I see is probably 50 fat kgs, and if you times that by how we're paid, it's around $20 per kg. That's $1,000 more. So this herd, if we take the 2-year-olds, this top group is basically bringing, because it's 40 kgs, about $800 more from this group per animal than this one. So to make it an average, if we could eliminate that fourth one with, let's say, beef semen, and then have the top end to sex, then you could see how much that makes your farm more efficient. You can milk less cows and fill that quota, or if you want to grow, you can fill more quota with the same amount of cows. And that's the theory that you'd be going down, of trying to get those best genetics in your herd and reproduce them.
So I should introduce my trusty assistant here. Greg's going to be speaking more than me shortly, and you'll be happy to hear that. But so Greg is our genetic advisor here in BC, in the Lower Mainland, the western side of the Lower Mainland, and Vancouver Island. And Greg is passionate about genetics as well, so he's going to be doing the usage of the CMEX tools and that demo as we move from the higher level point of view. But, so thanks, Greg, for helping out here today. All right, so fat yield between top and bottom quartiles suggests a very good return on your genetics, because this is only one lactation. So if we have $800 or close to $1,000 difference from top to bottom, obviously what most producers ask as soon as you see this is, who's in that bottom quartile? How did we get those lower animals? And no matter what you do, you'll always have a lower quartile. But it's still interesting to know. And in the past, what we would typically see is in the lower quartile, that favorite cow that John had that he wanted one more heifer calf from was hard to get pregnant. And so what did we do? We used expensive semen on first, second, maybe even third service. And eventually we just wanted to get the cow pregnant, and we used cleanup semen. So we had an older genetic cow bred to an older genetic sire. We got a heifer calf, and because we got a heifer calf, we raised it. But genetically, that calf was not as progressive. Maybe she was still a great calf, and if he's farming for the love of creating another great animal, maybe that animal is going to be another excellent cow. But if you're a profit-minded producer and you have to look at the numbers, Pro Dollar and a composite index and a focus on profitability will get you to your goal quicker. All right, so one of the things this will be kind of our handoff to Greg, but I've got a couple of slides here that are now transitioning to tools to assist you in your genetic selection for your herd. And whether you do your own genetic selection, pick the bulls, or pick the bulls with your genetic consultant, one of the important things to do occasionally is to take a broader view of, where am I at? A benchmarking approach. And I think the CMEX tools are exceptional for this. This is what we call a herd view within a cow view file. But this takes all of your animals, and it provides a glimpse of the different groups. So you can see calves, yearlings, lactation 1 and 2. You see how much progress you're making. Generally, the default is to your own client index. We'll get more into what that client index is. But you see the spread of your animals. So you can see where we are at in terms of how close to the middle, how much of a distribution. But you also see where you're at relative to the population for a particular trait. Sorry, milk is cows, heifers. Sorry, cows, heifers, population. So we're significantly ahead of the population for milk, for fat, and for protein. This is actually a herd that's actually in the room, but we won't disclose right now unless someone wants to fess up to it. But this is the reason I like this as well, is because it provides you with a quick snapshot of the weaknesses that are most prominent in your cows and in your heifers, and for the same trait to see if you're addressing the traits that are the weaknesses. So in the case of milk, we see a lot more in the cows than in the heifers, and the same thing for fat. So obviously we're making significant progress in this particular herd. Okay. So that herd view also provides a similar summary for health traits relative to the population, and also showing which weaknesses and whether or not we're addressing them. In this particular case, we've got somatic cell count as one that's prominent and still prominent in the heifers. So maybe we need to focus on that a bit more. That would be what I would be having a conversation with the producer about. Okay. And then you have the same for your confirmation traits. And Greg, I'm going to let you speak to this one because you've got some insight on this, and then I'll take the chair and you can drive from here.
So I will talk to this one. This one shows here, so you see phenotypic data. So this is the classifier comes. And then here we have genotypic data on a bunch of different data sets. So at the top, you can see that this person's a little bit above average on the population, and heifers are coming a good way compared to cows. Mammary's been pretty stagnant, and feet and legs. It said the heifers are coming a little bit too. I'm assuming at this farm production has been a focus, because on the mammary side and the confirmation where they've been as well, just because if the mammary is stagnant, it is difficult to have your highest producer also be your best uddered cow. So on this case, you can see in the green, the lighter green, you get the heifers. So certain traits like pin width obviously have had a lot of, we've taken almost all the weakness out. So width, pin width likely was, or width in general, was something that we put a high focus on at this herd with the genetic advisor. And then you have certain traits in there where you can, if you're focusing on, you can see kind of your progress.
Teat length would be a good one.
So if the teat length, I guess on the, Paul's point was we have 19% of the cows had a teat length issue, and now on the heifers we only have 5%. And all this information on the individual cows goes into on the mating guide side as well, and that's the mating guide tries to fix these issues as well when there's a weakness. Phenotypically, there's sometimes they match evenly. So sometimes you'll get it where 18% was the phenotypic weakness, and sometimes 18% is also genotypic. There's also nuance of why sometimes they're different. So it could be that you're showing the animals at a very young age, and that creates the difference, or what was behind the genetics hasn't come through yet. You don't always get that perfect cross goes right in between. You may get more of a certain side, or one may have more of an influence. So some of the phenotypic data is good to go over if you're not happy with something with your genetic advisor, to, hey, what is going on here? And sometimes it's a management thing, and that can affect it too. I was talking to a classifier that used to work on a farm in Manitoba, and at their farm, they had an issue with their heifers getting fat, and those heifers would come in with a lot of extra weight, and it would kind of, udder texture on their heifers was a little more poor. Now they got great production out of the animals, but he said that focusing on making sure their heifers didn't get fat affected their classification quite a bit, because their udders actually did a lot better when the heifers never got fat at any point. So these different management things can also affect how this comes out. But with your genetic advisor, you have the opportunity to look at where you're trending and where you want to fix. And that's really nice thing about the herd view, is it gives you, on the daughters you have, a good snapshot of where you're going, where you're coming from, and what you could do to improve in the future.
Talk to that.
So on this side, this is also part of the herd view. It shows you the haplotypes, the recessives, and the incidences in the herd, and compared to the population. This is where it can be important to use a mating guide. I know not all of us like to, because there's a pride to making your own matings, and it doesn't mean that the Optimate has to take it from you, but it lets you know if a cross shouldn't happen. So at this farm, the muscle weakness has been more prevalent. Some of the bulls that have been popular used here are higher in the herd. And so if they don't use a mating guide, you can have it where these things come out into your calves more often. And some of these will be that they never became a calf because they lost the pregnancy. So that's the kind of the value of the mating guide, but it shows you how much you have in each category. So yeah, there's obviously HH1 or HH1, HH2, HH3. Those ones are often the ones they'll lose the pregnancy because of the two recessives. And then something like HCD, the calf won't grow if you had two recessives. I learned that the hard way when one of my favorite animal or calves or one of my favorite cows wasn't growing, and I thought I wasn't feeding the calves properly. Found out later from Holstein Canada event that those two bulls that were selected together had HCD, and that's always a frustrating thing. So this is kind of a cool snapshot, but also gets protected if you use a mating guide. And there's other ways we can print it off for you if it's something you want to know on your own herd. So here I'll show some of the tools that we have that can be very handy. I asked permission from a farm that I get to work with. So right away, how we select the bulls at this farm, we use the CMX Works. So we'll just make sure I don't push it. If I click too quickly, it gets upset. So we have a pie graph of how the mix we would want. We enter in the information of the farm, and then some of the traits. So we put a value of things we want to focus on, and then as well, certain cutoffs. So at this farm, this was actually implemented pretty by Carl, probably a little bit different numbers at the time, but Aaronsdale has been very happy with. They've worked with 3 reps since they started breeding AI, and they wanted to just have a very uniform herd. That was the goal. So we took some of the middle ground traits, as I call it, or the swing traits, and they didn't want teats that were too close. They didn't want teats that were too short. They didn't want legs that were getting too straight, because that was a breed issue, and rumps getting too high. And then with the rotary, they didn't want to have to slow down the rotary for a cow that was milking, so they put 95 as a cutoff. And they didn't want to have the workers go and how could machine back up. So temperament was put in there, and then mastitis resistance, trying to make sure we're not taking on any bulls that are below. So this eliminates bulls that we don't even have to see, and that allows you to kind of not get distracted by something fancy, so to speak. So this is how we have it set up, the pie graph client index for Aaronsdale. So he wanted to put high value on fat and production overall, wanted to put a high value on health and fertility traits, but in particular daughter fertility and somatic cell. And then on feet and legs, that's been a pretty strong goal the whole time for him. So we put a lot on feet and legs overall, and rump as well.